The pilot circled low over a rural southern airstrip just after midnight, watching his fuel gauge sink while the usual line of car headlights never showed. And this landing had always followed a rhythm learned through repetition. Yet tonight the silence felt wrong in a way that suggested trouble started far away. The strip sat outside town limits, surrounded by fields that had hosted dozens of smooth arrivals without questions or paperwork for several steady years, and somewhere earlier in the chain, something had cracked quietly, leaving this plane hanging over darkness with no signals and no margin left. That route had run openly for so long that folks nearby stopped asking why planes arrived late. Right until the night everything tightened at once. Carlos Enrique Leder Rivas was born in 1949 in Armenia, Colombia, a coffee region shaped by trade routes, migration, and steady movement rather than isolation. And his early surroundings quietly trained him to notice how things flowed. His father, Wilhelm Leder, was a German immigrant who arrived decades earlier as a railroad engineer, while his mother, Helena Rivas, worked as a local school teacher, creating a household that never fully blended into one identity. German language and discipline filled the home, while Colombian street life shaped everything beyond the door, leaving Carlos comfortable living between systems without committing fully to either one. Armenia itself sat along export corridors where coffee moved outward daily, showing him how goods left quietly while money returned louder, even when authority barely showed up. By his early teens, Carlos had already traveled beyond Colombia, absorbing airports, visas, and foreign accents as routine experiences instead of rare privileges, which made movement feel normal instead of risky. Friends later recalled his interest in airplanes and travel, not as fantasy or hero worship, but as curiosity about access, speed, and reach. He watched how planes connected places that never touched directly, and how distance could shrink without warning. That early exposure built comfort around transition points where things changed hands quickly and questions rarely followed. Those habits mattered later, even when his life shifted into darker spaces. In the mid-1960s, while still a teenager, Carlos moved to New York City, landing inside a world that moved faster than Armenia, but followed rules that could be bent. He drifted through Queens and Manhattan during a period when borders felt loose. Counterculture thrived, and enforcement rarely kept pace with activity. He did not arrive broke or desperate, but restless, curious, and willing to test limits without panic. School barely held his attention, while street movement, late nights, and small hustles taught quicker lessons. Motion mattered more than belonging, and he learned early that speed often covered mistakes. By the late 1960s, Carlos had slipped into petty crime circles, focusing on car theft, resale schemes, and low-level marijuana distribution that blended easily into city noise. He learned how stolen vehicles changed identities, how paperwork disappeared, and how attention shifted elsewhere when money moved smoothly. None of it felt dramatic or violent, and most of it passed unnoticed by people who looked the other way. Arrests came eventually, though not with surprise, and courtrooms became another place where systems revealed gaps. Those encounters showed him enforcement worked slowly, while opportunity rarely waited. His incarceration in the early 1970s did not feel like collapse, but rather a pause where ideas sorted themselves among people who understood movement differently. Inside Danbury Federal Correctional Institution, he met smugglers, pilots, and men who already understood transport routes, border weaknesses, and profit margins. Prison conversations focus less on ideology and more on efficiency, timing, and how mistakes traveled further than success. That environment stripped crime of glamour, leaving only structure, repetition, and scale. Carlos listened more than he talked, tracking which stories sounded exaggerated and which sounded workable. It was there that he met George Jung, a Massachusetts native already experienced with flying marijuana across borders, and their discussion stayed practical from the beginning. Jung talked about aircraft range, fuel limits, landing windows, and risk distribution, while Carlos supplied geographic knowledge, contacts, and a willingness to think larger. Neither framed their conversations around rebellion or culture, since both focused on reducing friction inside existing systems. Prison gave them time to refine ideas without distraction, turning abstract plans into logistical outlines. By the time release approached, ideology mattered less than execution. Carlos left prison with a sharper focus than when he entered, seeing logistics as the real lever behind scale, power, and invisibility. He no longer thought in terms of deals or schemes, but in routes, timing, and repetition that reduced exposure. The lesson was simple and heavy, since systems failed less often than people did, and movement created cover when done correctly. That understanding stayed with him, shaping every decision that followed once he stepped back outside. Prison did not change his direction, but it clarified what actually moved weight. Danbury Federal Correctional Institution did not feel like a collapse point was Carlos later, since it functioned more like a holding space where men compared notes about what worked outside. The facility in Connecticut housed white-collar offenders, smugglers, and pilots whose crimes revolved around movement rather than street violence. Days followed strict routines, yet conversations moved freely inside shared spaces where experience carried more weight than reputation. Leader paid attention to who spoke with precision and who exaggerated, learning quickly that credibility mattered more than charisma. Prison stripped stories down to logistics, forcing every idea to survive questions about timing, distance, and risk. George Jung entered Later's orbit through proximity rather than introduction, since shared schedules and overlapping spaces pushed them into repeated contact. Jung was already known inside Danbury for flying marijuana across borders, not loudly, but with enough detail that others listened. He spoke in practical terms about aircraft range, fuel loads, weather windows, and landing zones, avoiding drama or bravado. Leader recognized that Jung thought in systems rather than impulses, which aligned with his own growing focus on structure. Their conversation started casual, then gradually narrowed toward transport mechanics that others rarely understood. The alignment between them formed without ceremony, since each man carried a different piece of the same puzzle. Jung understood aviation and American distribution routes, while Later knew Colombian geography, contacts, and sourcing realities. Neither treated the other like a friend, since trust inside prison developed through repetition rather than sentiment. They tested ideas against facts, correcting each other when assumptions fell apart under scrutiny. That balance created something functional rather than emotional, which mattered more than loyalty. During those talks, cocaine entered the picture as a manageable product rather than a dangerous one, since laws at the time treated it lightly. In the early 1970s, cocaine cases rarely carried the weight later decades attached to them, especially compared to marijuana trafficking. Jung explained that penalties stayed lower, enforcement stayed slower, and public perception barely treated cocaine as a threat. Leader listened carefully, recognizing that risk calculation depended more on legal framing than moral panic. That distinction made cocaine look small enough to scale quietly. Air travel felt cleaner to both men than border runs, since aircraft bypassed checkpoints, dogs, and ground patrol patterns. Jung described how planes erase distance while reducing human contact, keeping exposure minimal when done correctly. Leader understood how geography favored flight, especially across water or jungle terrain where radar coverage stayed thin. Together, they discussed how aviation created flexibility, allowing routes to shift faster than enforcement could adjust. Airplanes did not wait in lines, which made them attractive tools for moving product efficiently. Their discussions avoided ideology or rebellion language, staying focused on how systems responded under pressure. They mapped routes in conversation, starting with short hops and gradually extending reach as confidence grew. Leader talked about Colombian airstrips carved into rural regions, while Jung explained private American landing zones hidden behind farmland. Each filled gaps the other lacked, creating outlines that sounded less like dreams and more like drafts. Prison time gave them space to refine those drafts without interference. Other inmates noticed their conversations but misunderstood the depth, assuming it stayed hypothetical like most prison talk. Later, Jung kept details tight, sharing only what was necessary, since loose words traveled fast inside institutions. They spoke about aircraft types like Cessna models, discussing payload limits and maintenance requirements without exaggeration. Timing mattered more than speed, since predictable schedules attracted attention. Every detail aimed toward repeatability rather than spectacle. Cocaine's appeal grew inside those discussions due to its volume-to-value ratio, which suited air transport perfectly. Small packages carried high returns, reducing the need for large crews or extended storage. Leader pointed out how fewer hands meant fewer leaks, lowering exposure across the chain. Jung added that flights could blend into legitimate aviation traffic, especially in coastal regions. That combination made cocaine feel controllable rather than chaotic. As release dates approached, their conversation shifted from theory to sequencing. Focusing on first moves rather than long-term dominance, they discussed initial test runs, choosing routes that minimized attention while confirming reliability. Neither man talked about violence or control, since their plan depended on invisibility rather than intimidation. The outside world still treated cocaine casually, which created space to operate quietly. That gap between perception and reality mattered more than any muscle. When both men eventually walked out of Danbury, the plan already existed in working form, waiting only for execution. They did not leave with grand declarations, since confidence rested in preparation rather than noise. Leader understood that systems rewarded patience, while Jung trusted aviation discipline to handle risk. The world outside had not caught up to what they intended, still seeing cocaine as a niche indulgence rather than a scalable commodity. That delay created opportunity, and both men recognized it without needing to say much. When Carlos Lader and George Jung stepped back into the outside world during the early 1970s, they did not rush towards spectacle or expansion, since their first focus stayed locked on testing movement. Their earliest operations leaned on suitcases carried through commercial airports, starting with short hops between Colombia, Miami, and Los Angeles. Cocaine moved in small quantities, tucked into luggage that blended with tourist traffic moving through busy terminals daily. Each trip followed the same pattern, checking weight, timing flights, and choosing airports where customs scrutiny stayed inconsistent. Repetition mattered more than speed, since proving reliability came before chasing volume. Miami became an early anchor, not for glamour, but for convenience, since flights from Colombia landed frequently and customs enforcement varied by shift. Los Angeles followed quickly, offering distance that tested logistics while opening access to broader distribution networks. Hotel rooms turned into temporary staging points where luggage was unpacked, weighed, and repacked without ceremony. Jung handled distribution on the American side, using contacts who moved product quietly through existing social circles. Leder focused on sourcing and coordination, keeping Colombian connections steady while monitoring flow. Routine shaped confidence faster than bravado ever could, since each successful run reduced fear without raising alarms. Airport staff saw familiar faces pass through repeatedly, while customs officers rarely remembered individuals carrying legal luggage. Cocaine still lacked the stigma it later carried, making suspicion rare and penalties light when compared to other narcotics. Money arrived quickly, often within days, without waiting on extended negotiations or territorial disputes. That speed created a sense of insulation, where consequences felt distant and abstract. Early profits stayed modest by later standards, yet they confirmed the system worked under real conditions. Jung reinvested earnings into additional runs rather than luxury, focusing on expanding frequency instead of size. Leder tracked margins carefully, noting how costs stayed predictable while returns climbed steadily. Neither man treated success as proof of invincibility, though confidence grew naturally as runs stacked without interruption. Each trip validated assumptions formed earlier inside Danbury. As word spread quietly through trusted circles, more pilots expressed interest, drawn by low barriers and fast payment. These pilots were not thrill seekers, but working aviators comfortable with rules and procedures. They viewed suitcase runs as temporary work that fit neatly into existing travel schedules. Additional planes entered rotation, increasing capacity without attracting attention through scale alone. That gradual expansion allowed the operation to breathe without forcing sudden visibility. Money continued arriving faster than scrutiny, reinforcing the belief that enforcement lagged behind reality. Airport routines remained unchanged, while laws still treated cocaine as a minor offense compared to marijuana. Media coverage barely mentioned the substance, framing it as a niche indulgence rather than a growing trade. That disconnect encouraged looser talk among peripheral helpers who mistook early success for permanent cover. Leder noticed the shift but understood talk alone did not move product. Hotel rooms across Miami Beach and Los Angeles became familiar, serving as quiet hubs rather than flashy backdrops. Luggage carts rolled through lobbies unnoticed, blending into constant tourist movement. Transactions happened quickly, minimizing exposure while maximizing turnover. Jung's distribution channels adapted smoothly, absorbing increased supply without strain. Everything suggested the model could scale further if handled carefully. Yet repetition carried its own warning signs, since frequency risked pattern recognition over time. Suitcases limited volume, forcing more trips to meet rising demand. More trips meant more exposure, even if each run remained clean individually. Leder recognized that growth demanded efficiency, not simply more movement. The market began pulling harder, signaling appetite beyond what personal travel could sustain. As cocaine demand expanded during the mid-1970s, customers expected faster delivery in larger quantities. Suitcases that once felt sufficient now constrained supply, creating bottlenecks at sourcing and distribution points. Jung felt the pressure on the American side, where buyers asked for consistency beyond what individual couriers could provide. Leader faced similar strain in Colombia, where supply outpaced transport capacity. The system still functioned, but friction appeared at its edges. That realization marked a turning point, not through failure, but through success pushing against its own limits. Suitcase runs proved the concept beyond doubt, validating trust, logistics, and profit potential. However, scaling required new methods that reduced reliance on individual travelers. Both men understood that air travel offered more than passenger flights. The question shifted toward how to move weight without increasing visibility. By the time they stepped back to assess operations, the answer felt clear without needing discussion. Suitcases had carried them far enough, but the market wanted volume delivered with the same invisibility. The next phase demanded aircraft dedicated to transport rather than personal travel. What worked once now moved too slowly for what lay ahead. Norman's Cay entered Carlos Lader's thinking as a solution shaped by geography rather than imagination, since the island already sat inside existing flight paths between Colombia and the United States. The small island rested in the Exuma chain of the Bahamas, roughly 200 miles southeast of Florida, positioned perfectly between source and destination. Aircraft moving north naturally passed nearby, making deviation minimal and fuel calculations predictable. Unlike major islands, Norman's Cay carried little permanent population and almost no serious law enforcement presence during the early 1970s. That absence did not signal safety, but it created space where routine activity blended into background noise. Location mattered first, since shallow waters limited large vessel traffic while still allowing small boats and aircraft to operate freely. The surrounding sea complicated radar coverage, while weather patterns offered consistent flying windows throughout the year. Leader recognized that isolation worked best when paired with accessibility, allowing movement without attention rather than hiding entirely. Norman's Cay fit that balance, offering distance from scrutiny without the burden of remoteness. The island's geography reduced friction rather than eliminating risk. Ownership came next, handled quietly through Bahamian channels that favored cash transactions and informal agreements. Leader acquired control of the island in the mid-1970s, reportedly paying several $100,000 to secure long-term use rather than formal title. Local officials viewed the deal as foreign investment, not intrusion, especially since development promised jobs and infrastructure. No single transaction raised alarms, since paperwork moved slowly and oversight stayed fragmented. Control arrived through accumulation rather than declaration. Once access stabilized, construction followed in stages, each addition justified as improvement rather than fortification. The existing airstrip received attention first, since reliability mattered more than length initially. Crews resurfaced portions of the runway, extended usable distance, and installed basic lighting to support night operations. These changes occurred gradually, blending into legitimate development projects common across the Bahamas at the time. Each upgrade improved capacity without drawing concentrated attention. Communications infrastructure followed, giving Norman's Cay direct links to aircraft and boats moving through the region. Radios replaced guesswork, allowing pilots to coordinate arrivals without visible signals. Leader invested in aviation-grade equipment, ensuring compatibility with civilian aircraft standards. Communication reduced uncertainty, keeping operations predictable while minimizing exposure. Quiet coordination replaced improvised landings. Security developed next, not as a show of force, but as controlled access management. Leader hired Bahamian locals and imported guards to monitor airstrip activity and shoreline approaches. These men function less like soldiers and more like gatekeepers, filtering movement without confrontation. Weapons existed, though rarely displayed, reinforcing deterrence without spectacle. Security stayed layered and restrained, matching the island's low profile. Infrastructure continued expanding as traffic increased, adding fuel storage, hangars, and maintenance facilities over time. Fuel tanks allowed aircraft to refuel without returning immediately, increasing range and flexibility. Hangars protected planes from weather while reducing visibility from passing aircraft. Maintenance crews handled routine checks, keeping aircraft operational without relying on mainland facilities. Each addition increased autonomy while preserving camouflage. Norman's Cay also developed accommodations that appeared legitimate, including small lodges and recreational amenities. These features supported the appearance of a private retreat rather than an operational hub. Visitors arrived occasionally, reinforcing the island's civilian image. Parties occurred, though not constantly, maintaining a balance between activity and quiet. Normalcy served as cover better than secrecy. Later managed operations personally at times, overseeing schedules and resolving issues as they arose. He understood that presence discouraged mistakes, while distance encouraged shortcuts. His role remained administrative rather than theatrical, focusing on flow rather than dominance. Others handled day-to-day logistics, allowing him to monitor broader patterns. Control depended on coordination rather than intimidation. The island's isolation worked as camouflage rather than protection, since attention rarely focused on places assumed unimportant. Bahamian authorities lacked resources to monitor every small island consistently. American enforcement concentrated on mainland ports and major airports, leaving gaps offshore. Norman's Cay existed between jurisdictions, benefiting from fragmented responsibility. That liminal space mattered more than any defensive measure. Traffic increased steadily, with aircraft arriving from Colombia, carrying cocaine and departing northward after brief stops. Transfers happened efficiently, minimizing time on the ground. Boats occasionally moved product onward, adding flexibility to distribution routes. Everything followed schedules that prioritized predictability over speed. Routine reduced risk by making activity feel ordinary. Over time, Norman's Cay transformed quietly into a midpoint where movement paused briefly before continuing. Officially, the island remained a private development with limited activity. Unofficially, it functioned as a relay station, linking continents without documentation. Nothing about it advertised its purpose, yet everything passed through it efficiently. The island existed in plain sight, serving as connective tissue between worlds that rarely acknowledged each other. Arrivals at Norman's Cay happened quickly, rarely lingering beyond refueling and transfer windows that stayed tight by design. Ground crews met aircraft with practiced efficiency, moving cargo into waiting planes or boats depending on downstream demand. Planes heading north launched within hours, sometimes minutes, reducing exposure while maintaining flow. The Cay functioned like a relay station, not a warehouse, keeping movement continuous. That rhythm reduced attention, since nothing appeared static long enough to invite curiosity. Flights northward targeted Florida first, using private airstrips scattered across rural areas where aviation blended into daily life. Pilots favored low-altitude routes along coastlines and marshlands, staying beneath commercial corridors. Fuel math dictated landing choices, since smaller strips offered limited reserves and narrow margins. Each landing followed rehearsed procedures, minimizing ground time while resetting aircraft for the next leg. Familiarity replaced fear as repetition smoothed every step. Florida strips led naturally into Georgia and the Carolinas, extending reach while maintaining consistency. Aircraft followed agricultural corridors where crop dusters and private planes operated routinely. Timing flights around dawn or dusk reduced visibility, blending arrivals into local patterns. Pilots avoided major airports entirely, favoring places where a plane landing raised little interest. Geography became an ally when treated with respect. Small towns entered the picture gradually, not through recruitment, but through routine presence that normalized activity. Locals saw planes arrive repeatedly, unloading cargo quietly, then departing without incident. Over time, questions faded as repetition built comfort rather than suspicion. Farmers, mechanics, and fuel suppliers treated arrivals as business, not mystery. Normalcy proved more effective than secrecy. Helpers emerged organically, drawn by convenience rather than ideology. A mechanic appreciated steady work repairing aircraft without paperwork delays. A fuel supplier valued cash payments that arrived on time without dispute. A landowner welcomed rent for strip access that did not interfere with daily operations. None required loyalty or belief, only reliability and discretion. These relationships depended on predictability rather than trust ceremonies, since consistency spoke louder than promises. Payment stayed prompt, schedules stayed tight, and disruption stayed rare. Helpers blended into routines they already understood, folding new tasks into existing workflows. No one needed explanations beyond practical instructions. The system rewarded competence quietly. Pilots adjusted routes constantly, responding to weather, enforcement chatter, and mechanical realities. Low-altitude flying demanded attention, especially at night when visual cues disappeared. Instruments guided movement, while terrain awareness prevented disaster. Fuel stops became strategic choices rather than emergencies. Every flight reinforced discipline through repetition. As volume increased, frequency replaced size as the primary growth lever. More flights moved smaller loads, spreading risk while meeting demand. This approach kept losses manageable when issues occurred. Pilots rotated to prevent patterns from forming. Aircraft types varied slightly, avoiding easy identification. Small towns adapted without realizing it, incorporating the air bridge into local rhythms. A late-night landing became routine noise, not an event. Locals stopped tracking tail numbers or arrival times. Familiarity dulled curiosity faster than any bribe. Routine buried significance. Leader monitored flow indirectly, relying on reports rather than constant presence. He understood that distance preserved perspective while preventing micromanagement. Jung handled distribution coordination stateside, ensuring product moved onward quickly. Communication stayed functional, not verbose, limiting exposure. Silence mattered as much as clarity. Weather played its role, occasionally forcing delays that tested patience and planning. Storm systems altered routes, demanding quick recalculation of fuel needs. Pilots learned to read forecasts like maps, adjusting departure windows accordingly. Flexibility became essential, separating professionals from amateurs. Each challenge refined the system further. Enforcement lagged behind activity, focusing on ports and highways rather than scattered airstrips. Radar coverage remained inconsistent, especially offshore. Jurisdictional confusion slowed response, leaving gaps between agencies. Those gaps formed corridors where movement thrived quietly. The air bridge exploited space rather than force. As flights multiplied, the system reached a point where activity felt ordinary even to those involved. Pilots treated runs like scheduled jobs, not risky ventures. Helpers expected arrivals, planning around them without discussion. Payments flowed automatically, reinforcing stability. Motion became background. That normalization carried its own danger, since repetition reduced vigilance gradually. When nothing went wrong for long stretches, attention drifted. The system now moved often enough that individual flights blurred together. What once required planning now felt automatic. The air bridge opened fully, carrying weight without drawing eyes. The southern towns folded into the route slowly, never announced as destinations, since planes arrived first as occasional visitors before becoming expected sights. Rural Florida strips near Lake Okeechobee, South Georgia farmland outside Valdosta, and coastal Carolina fields entered the picture through repetition rather than recruitment. These places already hosted crop dusters, charter pilots, and private aircraft, which made unfamiliar tail numbers less noticeable over time. Planes landed late or early, parked briefly, then lifted off again, fitting into rhythms locals already understood. Familiarity replaced suspicion gradually, not through persuasion, but through consistent presence that never disrupted daily life. Airstrips adapted first, usually without formal changes, since most were private or lightly regulated under Federal Aviation Administration classifications for non-commercial use. Grass runways stayed unlit, relying on portable lighting or vehicle headlights positioned only when needed. Farmers who owned land near these strips treated arrivals like seasonal work, adjusting schedules without discussion. The strips did not expand visibly, avoiding attention, while use increased quietly through frequency. What mattered was access, not appearance. Farms surrounding these landing zones became part of the landscape without needing explanation, since agricultural operations already handled fuel, machinery, and late hours. A tractor parked near a runway looked ordinary, even when it shielded unloading activity briefly. Storage barns housed equipment alongside temporary cargo without distinction. Workers present during odd hours did not attract concern, since harvest seasons demanded irregular schedules anyway. Normal agricultural noise covered movement effectively. Back roads connected strips to highways, threading through counties where traffic stayed light and patrol coverage spread thin. Vehicles moved cargo away from runways quickly, blending into pickup trucks already common on rural roads. Drivers followed routes learned through trial, avoiding towns during peak hours while using feeder roads that locals ignored. Maps mattered less than experience, since familiarity guided decisions better than signage. Each successful transfer reinforced the route's invisibility. Money circulated quietly through these towns, rarely appearing as sudden wealth, but as steady payments that solved small problems efficiently. Mechanics received cash for aircraft repairs performed promptly, appreciating reliability more than volume. Fuel suppliers sold aviation gasoline without delays, valuing customers who paid up front and asked few questions. Local diners and grocery stores saw increased business from pilots and helpers passing through, mistaking routine spending for ordinary commerce. That flow supported participation without altering lifestyles dramatically. Repairs became a key touch point, since aircraft required constant maintenance to sustain frequent flights. Mechanics in counties across Florida and Georgia handled engine checks, tire replacements, and routine inspections without logging unusual details. Paperwork stayed minimal, consistent with private aviation norms. Those mechanics did not view themselves as part of anything larger, since work resembled tasks they performed daily. Convenience guided choices more than complicity. Fuel purchases followed similar patterns, using small suppliers who served agricultural aviation regularly. Cash payments avoided invoicing delays, fitting practices already common in rural operations. Tanks refilled quietly, often at night, without crowding or spectacle. Suppliers saw consistency rather than spikes, which kept curiosity low. Payment reliability mattered more than volume, smoothing transactions naturally. Food and lodging added another layer, as pilots stayed briefly in motels that served highway traffic constantly. Names rarely registered, since guests arrived and departed daily without leaving impressions. Meals purchased at odd hours did not raise questions, matching long-haul trucking patterns. Staff treated pilots as transient workers rather than noteworthy figures. That anonymity shielded movement effectively. Favors replaced formal agreements over time, since relationships developed through repetition. A landowner delayed reporting a noise complaint, seeing no harm done. A county official overlooked minor zoning irregularities, prioritizing other issues. These actions stem from convenience rather than corruption, shaped by familiarity and perceived harmlessness. Lines blurred quietly, without anyone consciously stepping over them. Law enforcement presence remained limited, focused on highways and population centers rather than isolated strips. Sheriffs and deputies covered large territories with small staffs, responding to complaints rather than patrolling proactively. Aircraft arrivals rarely triggered calls since locals stopped noticing them. Even when reports surfaced, they often lacked detail, delaying response. Fragmented oversight created space. As the air bridge matured, individual landings lost significance, blending into accumulated activity. No single arrival appeared unusual enough to merit attention. Each event felt routine, both to participants and observers. That normalization reduced vigilance across the chain. The system now moved frequently enough that movement itself became background noise. This shift created the real vulnerability, though it went unnoticed at the time. When nothing stood out, patterns formed quietly. Repetition dulled awareness, allowing activity to persist without challenge. Small towns absorbed the route into daily life without acknowledging its scope. No single landing mattered anymore, which turned out to be exactly the problem. Carlos Leder's name began surfacing publicly during the late 1970s, not through indictments or seizures, but through microphones, pamphlets, and staged appearances that marked a shift in posture. After years of letting roots and intermediaries absorb attention, he started using radio stations in Colombia to broadcast opinions about extradition and foreign influence. These broadcasts aired on stations in Medellin and surrounding regions, where political commentary blended easily with entertainment programming. Leder's voice sounded deliberate rather than emotional, framing himself as a nationalist critic instead of a trafficker. That framing mattered, since it converted scrutiny into conversation rather than investigation. In 1979, Leder helped fund and promote the Movimiento Latino Nacional, a short-lived political organization built around opposition to extradition treaties with the United States. He spoke at small rallies, handed out flyers, and financed radio segments that attacked the idea of Colombians facing trial abroad. The movement lacked grassroots depth, yet it generated headlines that pulled his name into public discourse. Leder treated ideology as leverage, not belief, using politics to complicate enforcement rather than inspire followers. Visibility became a tool to disrupt simple narratives. His public presence expanded further through symbolic gestures designed to signal power and defiance simultaneously. Leader famously erected a billboard near Medellin featuring Pablo Escobar's face with anti-extradition slogans, tying cartel interests to nationalist imagery. These acts created confusion, blending criminal enterprise with political theater. Authorities struggled to categorize him, since his actions straddled activism and provocation. That ambiguity delayed direct response while raising his profile. Radio appearances continued, with Leader criticizing U.S. influence while avoiding direct admission of criminal activity. He framed extradition as colonial interference, appealing to historical grievances that resonated locally. Journalists repeated his statements, amplifying reach beyond intended audiences. Attention grew organically, driven by controversy rather than revelation. Leader understood that debate distracted from logistics. This visibility coincided with rising pressure on trafficking routes, including increased surveillance in the Bahamas and Florida. By the early 1980s, U.S. authorities intensified focus on offshore transit points, narrowing corridors that once felt open. Leader's decision to step out front aligned with this tightening environment, serving as counterpressure rather than celebration. Public noise redirected attention sideways, buying time for routes to adjust quietly. His ambition centered on preservation, not dominance. Inside the network, Leader's posture altered dynamics subtly but significantly. Pilots, handlers, and partners noticed the shift, interpreting public exposure as both protection and risk. Some viewed his speeches as bold shields, believing politics offered cover. Others worried that attention invited scrutiny beyond what logistics could absorb. Trust recalibrated, no longer resting solely on efficiency. George Young and other operational figures maintained distance from Leader's public activities, focusing on movement rather than messaging. Young continued coordinating distribution while avoiding media exposure entirely. The split between front-facing theatrics and back-end operations widened. That separation created tension, since visibility demanded coordination it rarely received. Logistics preferred silence, while performance demanded noise. Leader's public acts also attracted new associations, pulling him closer to figures like Pablo Escobar, who thrived under attention. Escobar embraced publicity as currency, using headlines to build myth alongside influence. Their overlap increased visibility for both, intertwining reputations regardless of operational independence. That association blurred lines inside the broader network. Attention became contagious. Symbolic gestures escalated, including publicized donations and grand statements that suggested ideological commitment. Leader spoke openly about resisting extradition, positioning himself as a spokesman rather than a facilitator. His rhetoric sharpened, gaining applause while generating files within intelligence agencies. Each appearance produced records that logistics alone never created. Paper trails multiplied where silence once prevailed. By 1982, Colombian authorities could no longer ignore his presence as speeches, broadcasts, and political activity crossed thresholds of tolerance. Surveillance increased not solely due to trafficking, but due to his visibility as a political irritant. Leader's belief that noise bought space proved partially correct, yet it also condensed attention around him personally. Routes adjusted, but eyes stayed fixed. Inside the trafficking network, decision-making slowed, weighed down by perception management. Partners debated exposure levels, questioning whether public noise protected or endangered operations. Some distanced themselves while others leaned in, betting on confusion as cover. That divergence strained coordination, since unity depended on shared risk assessment. Visibility fractured consensus. Leaders' posture also influenced enforcement priorities, shifting focus from diffuse routes toward identifiable personalities. Investigators began linking rhetoric to movement, piecing together fragments previously isolated. Media coverage fueled curiosity, prompting questions that logistics never triggered. The spotlight narrowed unpredictably, following faces instead of planes. That shift marked a critical change. As the early 1980s progressed, Leader's public persona overshadowed his logistical role, altering how threats manifested. Attention now followed him, regardless of where operations shifted geographically. Staying loud invited eyes that timing, fuel math, and low-altitude flying could not dodge indefinitely. Logistics had thrived on anonymity, yet performance demanded recognition. That contradiction tightened pressure across the entire system. By the early 1980s, Medellin had become less of a backdrop and more of a pressure chamber, where money, politics, and visibility collided daily without warning. Cocaine profits flooded neighborhoods like El Poblado and Envigado, reshaping social order while drawing attention from journalists, politicians, and foreign agencies. Pablo Escobar's name circulated widely, though not as a singular leader, but as one of several figures navigating overlapping interests. Meetings happened in homes, offices, and private clubs where decisions leaned toward survival rather than dominance. Leader entered these spaces carrying a different posture, louder and more confrontational than most preferred. Leader's approach clashed with quieter operators who relied on invisibility and compartmentalization to protect routes and profits. While others favored silence, shell companies and intermediaries, Leader leaned into speeches, billboards, and ideological framing that complicated matters. He spoke openly about extradition, American influence, and national sovereignty, creating noise that rippled through operations. Partners worried that attention invited scrutiny no amount of logistics could fully deflect. Disagreements surfaced in private discussions, where voices stayed low but frustration grew. Escobar, despite public perception, often balanced visibility with restraint, understanding when to step back to preserve flow. He recognized that power came from control rather than constant exposure, letting others absorb attention when useful. Leader, however, treated exposure as a shield, believing public presence deterred action. That difference created friction, not through confrontation, but through divergent risk tolerance. Conversations ended unresolved, leaving tension to simmer beneath routine transactions. As extradition threats intensified following Colombia's agreement with the United States in 1979, anxiety spread across trafficking networks. The possibility of facing American courts altered calculations drastically, prompting discussions about defense rather than expansion. Leader's vocal opposition positioned him as a lightning rod, attracting both support and suspicion. Others feared his rhetoric accelerated enforcement momentum rather than slowing it. That divide widened quietly. MAS, or Muerte a Secuestradores, emerged during this period as a response to kidnappings targeting traffickers and their families. Formed in 1981 after the abduction of Marta Nieves Ochoa, sister of the Ochoa brothers, MAS united traffickers, ranchers, and private interests under a banner of defense. Leader aligned with MIS pragmatically, viewing it as insurance against vulnerability rather than ideological commitment. He funded operations, provided resources, and attended meetings without adopting long-term political goals. Protection, not governance, drove involvement. Paramilitary alignment expanded as kidnappings and threats increased, drawing traffickers into conflicts they previously avoided. Leaders supported these groups selectively, focusing on securing personal safety and operational continuity. These alliances blurred lines between criminal enterprise and armed conflict, complicating enforcement responses. Some partners questioned whether such entanglements invited further instability. Disagreements surfaced over how far defense should extend. Meetings grew tense, with discussions circling exposure, strategy, and responsibility. Leaders argued that public resistance deterred extradition, while others countered that silence preserved roots. Neither side convinced the other, leaving decisions fragmented. Operational leaders adjusted independently, insulating themselves where possible. Coordination suffered subtly, though roots still functioned. Later's relationships within Medellin shifted as former allies limited contact to reduce association risk. Invitations slowed, conversations shortened, and information flowed less freely. He remained involved, yet increasingly peripheral to consensus. That isolation did not halt operations, but it altered his influence. Power redistributed quietly. Despite friction, the trafficking system continued running, driven by momentum rather than unity. Flights still departed, transfers still occurred, and money still moved. Logistics absorbed tension, maintaining output despite internal strain. The system's resilience masked underlying fractures. Success hid disagreement. By the mid-1980s, Leiter found himself more visible yet less integrated, caught between performance and practicality. His public stance attracted attention that others worked hard to avoid. Routes adjusted to compensate, but coordination suffered. He remained a player, though increasingly isolated. Even as planes kept flying, Leiter's position narrowed, signaling a shift that would soon carry consequences. By the early 1980s, the sense of invisibility that once protected the air bridge began thinning as pressure accumulated quietly from multiple directions at once. Bahamian authorities, prodded by U.S. agencies and embarrassed by growing international attention, started increasing raids across the Exuma chain. In 1982 and 1983, Royal Bahamas Police Force units conducted coordinated searches on several islands, officially framed as customs enforcement and anti-smuggling initiatives. Norman's Cay no longer felt peripheral, since intelligence reports had begun flagging unusual aviation activity moving through that corridor. Even when raids turned up little, their frequency altered the rhythm that operations depended on. The 1983 Bahamian crackdown marked a turning point as officials seized aircraft, fuel caches, and communications equipment from islands tied to trafficking routes. U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration agents worked alongside Bahamian counterparts, sharing radar data and flight logs. Surveillance flights increased, tracking low-altitude aircraft moving north from Colombia and pausing near the Bahamas. Pilots noticed patterns changing, with radar sweeps lingering longer and interception attempts growing more aggressive. What once felt like background noise now demanded attention. Leaks compounded the problem since pilots and peripheral helpers carried information that enforcement could exploit. Some aviators, pressured by arrests or financial strain, began cooperating quietly. Others talked carelessly, mistaking routine success for permanent safety. Informants emerged within aviation circles, passing along tail numbers, departure windows, and landing habits. Even partial disclosures disrupted planning. forcing constant recalibration. Trust thinned across the network as uncertainty replaced assumption. Leader and his partners responded by introducing redundancy, adding alternative strips, backup pilots, and parallel routes to absorb disruption. When one corridor tightened, another opened temporarily, maintaining flow despite friction. Aircraft rotated more frequently, changing identifiers to avoid tracking. Redundancy preserved movement, though it raised costs and complexity. Sabotage entered conversations cautiously, not through violence, but through suspicion that someone inside disrupted schedules deliberately. Missed landings, incorrect fuel loads, and delayed communications raised alarms. Operations paused briefly to assess reliability, disrupting cadence. Paranoia spread, though evidence stayed circumstantial. The lack of clear culprits worsened anxiety. Shifting locations became standard practice, moving staging points away from Norman's Cay toward lesser-known islands or mainland strips. Routes shortened or lengthened depending on surveillance density. Some flights bypassed the Cay entirely, using direct runs when weather and radar conditions allowed. Others relied more heavily on boats to bridge gaps. Flexibility replaced stability. Bahamian pressure extended beyond aviation, targeting financial flows and residency permits tied to foreign operators. Bank accounts faced scrutiny, slowing transactions that once moved freely. Local allies grew cautious, limiting involvement to reduce exposure. Even mundane tasks required discretion. The environment demanded constant vigilance. In the United States, surveillance tightened along the southern coast, with Customs and Border Protection increasing patrols across Florida and Georgia. Radar installations improved, closing gaps that low-altitude flights once exploited. Coordination between agencies improved incrementally, reducing jurisdictional confusion. Though enforcement still lagged behind activity, margins narrowed visibly. Informants provided enforcement with timelines and behavioral insights rather than complete maps, forcing traffickers to infer which elements were compromised. That uncertainty proved costly, as overcorrection sometimes created new vulnerabilities. Pilots flew longer routes to avoid suspected monitoring, burning fuel and increasing wear. Maintenance costs climbed, cutting into profits. Despite pressure, the route continued functioning through sheer adaptability. Redundant systems absorbed shocks, allowing flights to resume quickly after disruptions. Operations avoided dramatic responses, favoring quiet adjustments. Leaders' network leaned on experience accumulated over years. Momentum carried them forward, even as efficiency declined. Paranoia lingered, reshaping interactions and slowing decision-making. Meetings shortened, information compartmentalized further. Some partners withdrew entirely, preferring caution over profit. Others doubled down, betting redundancy could outpace enforcement indefinitely. Consensus fractured without collapse. By 1984, the air bridge still moved cocaine north, yet margins shrank rapidly under mounting costs and risk. Fuel expenses rose, bribes multiplied, and losses increased. What once felt smooth now required constant intervention. The route worked, but barely, held together by systems stretched thin. Pressure from every side transformed invisibility into endurance, signaling that time favored enforcement more than movement now. Carlos Later's capture did not arrive with gunfire or spectacle, since it unfolded through procedure on February 4th, 1987, inside a modest farmhouse outside Medellin. Colombian National Police units moved early that morning, acting on intelligence that placed Later at the location, following weeks of quiet surveillance. Officers secured the perimeter, entered without resistance, and took him into custody without a shootout or chase. There were no speeches, no final statements, and no attempt to flee, which made the moment feel administrative rather than dramatic. For someone whose public posture once thrived on attention, the arrest passed with unsettling calm. The speed of the operation fueled immediate rumors, since few believed a figure like Later could be located so precisely without inside information. Some whispered that Pablo Escobar had quietly given him up, clearing a loud liability during a period when Medellin leadership sought distance from attention. Others pointed toward Colombian intelligence services cooperating closely with the Drug Enforcement Administration, citing recent joint operations as evidence. Another version blamed disgruntled pilots or associates pressured by reduced margins and rising paranoia. No single explanation settled fully, leaving uncertainty to linger. Leader himself never offered a definitive account that closed the question, even during later interviews and court proceedings. He hinted at betrayal while avoiding names, suggesting decisions were made elsewhere beyond his control. Investigators maintained that technical surveillance and informant networks converge naturally, dismissing cartel intrigue. That gap between official narrative and street belief widened over time, feeding speculation without proof. Ambiguity became part of the story rather than a loose end. What mattered operationally was not how Leader was caught, but how quickly the system adapted once he disappeared. Within days, flights rerouted, contacts shifted, and schedules adjusted without interruption. Pilots continued operating under existing protocols, following redundancies built during earlier pressure phases. Payments still moved, aircraft still rotated, and small towns continued their routines unchanged. The absence of Leader did not stall movement. Norman's Cay had already declined in importance by that point, as routes diversified away from single hubs. Operators leaned on mainland strips, boats, and alternative islands to maintain flow. Leadership redistributed quietly, avoiding public reshuffling that might attract attention. No announcement marked the transition, since discretion mattered more than symbolism. The network behaved as if prepared for this outcome already. In Colombia, Later's arrest sent ripples through political and criminal circles, though reaction stayed muted. Newspapers reported the capture cautiously, emphasizing extradition implications rather than operational details. Officials framed it as a milestone in anti-narcotics efforts, while traffickers treated it as another adjustment point. No immediate violence followed, contradicting expectations shaped by later years. Silence replaced chaos. Extradition followed swiftly, marking a historic moment without ceremony. On February 5th, 1987, Colombia extradited Leader to the United States, making him the first Colombian drug trafficker sent north under revived agreements. The transfer occurred quietly, without public farewell or protest, signaling a shift in policy rather than triumph. Leader boarded a U.S. aircraft bound for Florida, beginning a legal process far removed from airstrips and routes. That movement carried symbolic weight beyond his individual case. Rumors persisted that his removal benefited quieter operators who preferred invisibility over confrontation. Others argued his public posture forced decisions that might have come eventually regardless. Some believed his arrest accelerated changes already underway, while others saw it as overdue correction. None of these interpretations fully explained how seamlessly operations continued. The system revealed resilience independent of any single personality. Inside the trafficking network, conversations avoided sentiment focusing instead on exposure levels and next steps. Leader's name receded quickly, replaced by discussions of logistics and enforcement patterns. Loyalty mattered less than continuity, reinforcing lessons learned over years of pressure. The network absorbed loss the way it absorbed weather delays or equipment failures. Adaptation remained instinctive. U.S. prosecutors moved efficiently, charging later with conspiracy to import cocaine, continuing criminal enterprise, and other offenses tied to operations spanning the 1970s and early 1980s. His case unfolded in federal court without spectacle, built on evidence collected quietly over time. Witnesses testified, documents surfaced, and sentences followed standard procedure. The narrative focused on crimes rather than myth. Extradition served as a signal rather than a climax, marking a new phase where legal reach extended further than before. It told operators that borders no longer guaranteed insulation, altering risk calculations permanently. Leaders' transfer did not end routes immediately, yet it changed how safety was defined. The air bridge still functioned, but certainty faded. What followed belonged less to personalities and more to pressure that no system could outrun forever. Carlos later arrived in the United States in February 1987 and was processed through Florida before his case settled into federal court, where prosecutors assembled years of quiet evidence. The trial opened in 1988 in Jacksonville, Florida, chosen carefully due to jurisdiction tied to air routes, seizures, and cooperating witnesses. Federal prosecutors charged Leader with conspiracy to import cocaine, operating a continuing criminal enterprise, and multiple narcotics violations spanning the 1970s and early 1980s. The government framed the case around logistics, flight records, pilot testimony, and financial trails rather than mythology or personality. Jurors heard less about speeches and more about timing, routes, and repeated actions tied to Norman's Cay and southern airstrips. Witnesses described aircraft movements from Colombia through the Bahamas into Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, tying names, dates, and tail numbers into a coherent operational map. Former pilots testified about low-altitude flying, fuel planning, and landing procedures, grounding the case in mechanics rather than ideology. Financial experts traced payments through banks and cash transactions that supported aircraft maintenance, fuel purchases, and compensation structures. Prosecutors avoided dramatics, letting repetition establish scale. The picture that emerged focused on function rather than spectacle. Leader's defense challenged credibility, arguing witnesses cooperated under pressure and exaggerated involvement. Attorneys questioned timelines, pointing to gaps and inconsistencies created by years passing between events and testimony. The defense also emphasized the absence of direct seizures, tying later physically to specific shipments. Despite those efforts, the volume of corroborating detail proved difficult to dismiss. Jurors returned a guilty verdict later that year, signaling acceptance of the operational narrative presented. In 1988, Leader received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a punishment reflecting both scale and symbolic weight. The sentence underscored how U.S. courts viewed leadership roles within trafficking networks during that period. Leader entered the federal prison system carrying notoriety rather than power. His public posture evaporated quickly once doors closed. Time replaced movement. Inside, Leader faced isolation shaped by security concerns and his high-profile status. He moved through facilities under close supervision, separated from general populations when deemed necessary. Communication narrowed, with letters monitored and visits controlled. The environment stripped away context that once mattered, leaving routine measured in counts, meals, and restricted movement. Years began compressing into patterns difficult to distinguish. The most consequential shift came through cooperation, not as confession, but as information exchange negotiated carefully over time. In the early 1990s, U.S. authorities approached Leader regarding testimony against Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian military leader accused of facilitating drug trafficking. Noriega's trial represented a geopolitical priority following the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama. Leader's knowledge carried value due to interactions involving routes, protection arrangements, and regional coordination. Cooperation centered on what could be corroborated rather than speculation. In 1992, Leader testified against Noriega in federal court, providing details about meetings, payments, and facilitation that supported the prosecution's case. His testimony focused on logistics and access rather than ideology, aligning with his long-standing emphasis on systems. That cooperation resulted in a sentence reduction, converting life without parole into a fixed term of 55 years. The adjustment reflected utility rather than forgiveness. Information moved, consequences adjusted. Not everything surfaced during cooperation, since later limited disclosures to areas with independent verification. Questions remained unanswered regarding certain partnerships, financial structures, and internal conflicts. Prosecutors accepted partial illumination over total exposure, prioritizing cases deemed strategically important. What stayed buried did so intentionally, protected by gaps in evidence or shifting priorities. Silence held value alongside speech. Following the Noriega testimony, Leader returned to long-term confinement, this time under a recalibrated sentence. He cycled through high-security federal facilities, including periods at USP Marion and ADX Florence. Conditions remained strict, with limited contact and minimal privileges. Time slowed further, defined by routines designed to manage risk rather than rehabilitation. The world outside evolved without his participation. During the mid-90s and early 2000s, Leader's name faded from headlines, resurfacing occasionally through appeals and administrative motions. Courts reviewed sentence calculations, credit allocations, and custody classifications without altering outcomes significantly. Leader filed complaints regarding conditions and treatment, reflecting strain rather than strategy. None reopened substantive discussion of his case. Momentum favored stasis. Inside prison, Leader's interactions narrowed to legal counsel, select inmates, and staff. He reportedly spent long stretches isolated, impacting mental and physical health. Medical issues emerged over time, complicating incarceration without altering status. Documentation replaced agency. Years accumulated quietly. Information that once moved rapidly through air bridges now moved slowly through legal channels, filtered and delayed. Leader's relevance shifted from operational actor to historical witness, consulted sparingly when convenient. New trafficking structures replaced older ones, rendering past details less actionable. Time eroded leverage steadily. In 2020, after serving more than 3 decades in U.S. custody, Leader was released due to time served, health considerations, and administrative determinations. He was deported to Germany, reflecting his citizenship through his father. The transfer occurred quietly, without ceremony or announcement, consistent with the procedural tone that marked later chapters. Germany represented neither home nor destination, but displacement. Leader arrived in Frankfurt removed from networks, influence, and context that once defined his life. The release did not close narratives or resolve questions lingering from decades earlier. It relocated him physically while leaving history intact elsewhere. Movement resumed without function. The courtrooms, cooperation, and years inside reshaped what information surfaced and what remained sealed. Testimony altered sentences, but not trajectories. Systems absorbed disclosures and adjusted accordingly. Release marked transition rather than resolution. Time continued forward, indifferent to past routes and former relevance. The southern airstrips still sit where they always did, stretching across rural Florida, South Georgia, and the Carolina lowlands, though today they carry crop dusters, hobby pilots, and emergency flights instead of cocaine. Grass runways near Lake Okeechobee remain active for agricultural aviation, while strips outside Valdosta and Tifton host private planes without drawing crowds or curiosity. Locals pass these places daily, rarely thinking about the mid-70s and early 80s nights when engines arrived low and fast. Time flattened those memories into background, absorbing disruption the way small towns always do. What once felt unusual settled into history without ceremony. The routes faded gradually rather than collapsing, shrinking as enforcement improved and logistics shifted toward maritime containers, highways, and later digital coordination. Norman's Cay lost relevance after Bahamian crackdowns in the mid-80s, and its airstrip now serves legitimate traffic and occasional tourists. Back roads that once carried unmarked cargo trucks now move produce, timber, and commuters. Mechanics who serviced planes returned fully to civilian work, and fuel suppliers adapted without missing the cash flow. Life adjusted without pause. Money that circulated quietly during those years never announced itself when it left, since towns rarely noticed absence as sharply as arrival. Repairs, meals, and motel stays blended back into normal patterns. No plaques marked the period, and no official reckoning followed. Silence protected continuity better than acknowledgement. Convenience had blurred lines, and time erased them further. Carlos later re-entered public conversation decades later, not as an operator, but as a figure discussed through interviews, books, and documentaries that revisit unresolved questions. From Germany, where he was deported after release in 2020, he spoke occasionally about extradition, prison, and betrayal without settling debates. His voice carried memory rather than influence, describing events already absorbed by systems that moved on. Attention returned briefly, then drifted elsewhere. Legacy stayed unsettled. What replaced the old routes did not resemble them closely, relying on shipping containers, financial instruments, and networks that never touched grass runways. Enforcement adapted as well, tracking money and data instead of tail numbers and fuel logs. The geography remained, but movement changed shape. Systems learned from what came before. Efficiency shifted upward and outward. The opening airstrip still lies quiet after midnight, though now silence means regulation rather than anticipation. Planes arrive with filed flight plans, radios monitored, and lights activated for safety instead of discretion. Movement slows, yet never stops entirely, since commerce always finds paths forward. What changed was not motion, but visibility. The ground remembers, even when the noise is gone.